Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Dorr. I'm the Director of Professional Development at the International Studies Association. For those of you that don't know, the International Studies Association is the largest interdisciplinary association that's dedicated to understanding transnational and global affairs, and it is based in global affairs at the University of Connecticut. So thank you for joining us today for writing policy briefs and op-eds, communicating research with policymakers and community. Today, we are joined by Carrie Racien, Deb Skosh, and Caitlin Caspi. And this event is co-sponsored by INCHIP at the University of Connecticut and the Connecticut branch of the Scholar Strategy Network. So without taking up too much time, because I want to leave a good chunk of time at the end for questions, we can go right into the content that our panelists have prepared. And any questions you can write in the chat or the Q&A feature. So Carrie, I will turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to just share my slides. Also going to start my stopwatch so I don't go over. So good afternoon. My name is Carrie Racien. I am a professor in the School of Public Policy, and I'm also the co-leader of the Connecticut chapter of the Scholar Strategy Network. And I'll talk a little bit about what the Scholar Strategy Network is in one of the slides as we move on. Part of my role in this presentation is to talk about a brief or an op-ed. What's the right tool for communicating with policymakers? In order to sort of tackle the title of that, we're going to define a policymaker. I tend to define policymakers quite broadly, maybe more broadly than some people do, but I think, oops, that's you're not supposed to see those yet. Perhaps more broadly than other people do. And so we can talk about that. Discuss the policymaking process. I think this is not a linear process, and it's open for communication at lots of different points of entry. And I think that's can be both daunting for some folks, but I think it also presents lots of opportunities for researchers and experts, et cetera, to infuse the process with expertise. And then why might you write either an op-ed or a brief? The key components of an op-ed or brief, and then some distinctions, and then my panelists will elaborate and provide some additional examples. Okay, so before we really get in though, I want to acknowledge that the policy landscape is like changing all over the place and rapidly. So, you know, this is a brief webinar, and it's meant to sort of give an overview and get us thinking about ways to engage in the policy process. But it's by no means sort of the end all or be all of what this looks like. And as the policy process changes, so do communication tools, and both have to be agile and adaptive. So please, you know, continue to think about that in this webinar and as you continue to do your work and engage with policymakers throughout this space. So who are policymakers? Who are these folks that we are like communicating with? Well, I think one thing to keep in mind, especially in Connecticut, so like I said, I'm a professor at the University of Connecticut, and so I talk a lot to Connecticut-based policymakers, also policymakers at the federal level. But for our Connecticut-based policymakers, they have a lot of variation in their background, especially in our legislative branch. Those policymakers are part-time legislators. Most of them have other jobs in addition to being legislators, and that's not uncommon in other state models, et cetera. So some may be lawyers, some may be real estate agents, some may be doctors, some may be formerly folks that sort of were stay-at-home parents and are now entering into the legislative realm. Some may be business folks and other sort of small business owners. Some may be farmers. Some may have been veterans, right? Like just lots of walks of life. Not only do they have a variation in background, they also have a variation in duties because policy is huge. Once someone said to me, wow, I didn't know that was policy. And I don't really remember what that was. But basically, if it's in the budget, if someone votes on it, it's policy. Policy is expansive. And our legislators often and policymakers often have to engage in things that aren't necessarily part of their wheelhouse, part of their expertise. And that's, I think, why this communication process is important. So policymakers exist at different levels of government, federal, state, local, and probably, in Connecticut, we don't have county government, but in jurisdictions that do, all kinds of overlapping governments in between, school districts, municipalities, all kinds of different things. All of those count in a federated system. Then, of course, there are different branches of government, which should be co-equal for all intents and purposes. Those are your legislative branch that write legislation. They are your executive branch that implement legislation, and they are the judicial branch that interpret if that legislation or statute is constitutional and legal in practice, right? And they all work together to carry out the functions of government. There are different channels of communications with policymakers. There can be civic intermediaries. That's what the Scholar Strategy Network considers itself to be. SSN is a national organization that is federated. That is, there are lots of subnational chapters. The Connecticut chapter is one. Not all of them are state chapters. Some are city-based or sort of collections of cities chapters. It looks different across the country, but there are 40 plus subnational chapters across the country. And we exist to try to bridge the gap between researchers and policymakers and journalism to try to sort of elevate the conversation around policy, to get research out of academia or wherever high quality research is being done and into the hands of policymakers, and also get those questions that policymakers have into the hands of researchers, right? So there's those, neither sort of point of the conversation is more important, but we want them sort of talking to each other. And that's the sort of civic intermediary. Sometimes people talk directly to each other. I'll have a conversation with some policymakers tomorrow on a Zoom, and we'll speak directly to each other. That's rare, but it does happen. It can happen. Sometimes there's written communication. That's really sort of the tenor of this webinar and what we're going to talk about here, which can be your published articles. I got to say, most policymakers don't read my published articles, but maybe they will. More likely, they're going to read an op-ed that might find itself in a journal publication, in a journalism publication, or a brief that might be accessible. Often our work is not only paywalled in a journal, but it is also dense and not accessible and just too long. And that's why the op-ed and the brief is important to communicate and disseminate that work. And finally, I would just say, like, there's partnership and ongoing dialogue with policymakers that's important, and just knowing what they are interested in and what's important to them and what are the ongoing policy conversations. That like extends beyond the op-ed and brief, but I think it's really important for knowing about like what's topical and pitching things and just being kind of aware. But that's like a different conversation, but I had to put it in there. So the policy making process, this comes from like a very much like an academic mindset of what the policy making process is. It's very tidy looking. And it starts with agenda setting. We make an agenda and decide what we're going to talk about. And then we formulate the policy. And then there's decision making, and we like vote on it in this very formal and like, organized manner. And then we implement it through the executive branch. And then there are some researchers, and they come and evaluate it, and they decide if it's having its intended consequences. And then if it's not, we terminate the policy because we only want to keep the policies that are working, and then it cycles. And I hope you can tell in my voice that it almost never works that way in the real world. And often, like, it also doesn't necessarily follow this nice, neat little circle. I can skip things, like things just don't always work this way, but this is the goal. The other thing I would say is it can cycle, and it should cycle multiple times. I spoke with someone yesterday about a conversation that we're trying to have around the role that insurance can play in gun injury prevention. A lot of my work is in gun injury prevention. And, our goal is just to try to get some briefs together to hopefully shorten the number of times that a policy might go through the policy cycle, right? It's not even to get it passed on the first time. Like it's very rare that a bill goes through the state legislature and gets passed on the first time that it's introduced, right? Many bills sort of pass and get amended and fail on the first time that they're introduced. That's not rare, that's common. And so just understanding and setting expectations that the policy process is iterative, it's incremental most of the time, not always, but generally it's incremental, is important for sort of knowing what it is, to just get level set the expectations of your communications. So why would you write an op-ed or brief? Both are communication tools. Both are designed to convey a point to your reader, and here a policymaker. Briefs, in my mind, though perhaps Debs and Caitlin will disagree, are sort of less time sensitive. That is, they're going to sort of exist for longer, perhaps. They might be something that can summarize an article. So most of my articles, I try to summarize a brief, and they just always live with the article, understanding that someone's probably never going to read the article, but they might read the brief, right? Which is kind of the Cliff Notes version. They also might sort of be something more summative and sort of like summarize the state of the evidence for someone, maybe on the state of childcare or universal school lunches, etc. So in that way, they might be tied, or they could be tied to a specific policy or debate process. Here's an example of a brief that's linked on our website, and we're happy to make these slides available. And what it does is it summarizes a paper. It's a little long for a brief. Usually I like a brief to be 1 to 2 pages. This one is 3 pages, but there's quite a bit of white space on the brief, and there are some tables and that sort of thing, but it summarizes a paper, right? And the paper's quite long and quite tedious, and so we made a brief to summarize a paper. And it's structured very much like an academic paper would be, summarizes the paper. And whenever I talk to policymakers about the paper, I do not bring the paper, I bring this brief instead. And this is how I present it. And what you can see at the bottom and the third thing, that's where the paper is linked, right? So if they want the paper, they're very welcome to go see the paper, but they probably never do. And I give them this in hard copy when I meet with them, and then I also email it to them in PDF. I've never met a policymaker who didn't also want it in paper copy. I don't know why they like paper copy, but they love paper copy. So contrasting that with an op-ed. So this is an op-ed that my colleague Jennifer Deneen and I wrote called "Good Guys with Guns May Be Heroes, but They're Not Our Solution." It was an opinion piece that appeared in Newsweek. We wrote this in response to an Indiana mall mass shooting that happened in July of 2022. In this particular mass shooting, the gunman had an AR-style rifle with 100+ rounds of ammunition. And this particular gunman was stopped by a Good Samaritan who fatally shot the gunman and saved countless lives. However, in that process, 3 lives were still lost, 2 folks were injured, and the gunman also died. And so while lots of folks were celebrating that this Good Samaritan stopped the gunman, as we say, a hero, we don't think a situation where 3 folks are dead, 3 innocent folks or 2 are dead, a gunman is dead, and 2 are injured is like a policy success, right? So the op-ed really focuses on that. And so where this is really different is it's in response to something specific. The brief is not in response to something specific. It's like sort of steady state, evergreen, right? Whereas this is very topical. Now, the concept that the good guys with guns aren't our policy solution, that is like something I would still say today, right? But it's in response to this news item that's just happened, right? And in the news cycle, what's new about it, that's called the lead, right? And so an op-ed, almost always to be published, needs a lead or a hook, something that makes it newsworthy. And so I actually have like a bunch of policy solutions that if something sort of happened, we would think about writing an op-ed for. And so that's just, but you need to tie it with current events, because that's what news editors need, for readers to find that appropriate. So here we have, in the thing, what we really need is to rent them. What we really wanted to do, a policy success, would be for that Indiana shooting to have never happened. That's what policy success looks like in our minds, in our opinion. This is an opinion piece. And then you start by building your argument early on. The best piece of advice I ever give people when they write an op-ed is that you put what you want to see happen early on. You do not save the best for last. You put it at the top because the reader's never going to make it to the end. If you're a researcher, you still put research in, but it goes in the middle. You understand your audience is very varied, especially if they're your policymakers. But this, unlike the brief, you're really writing for a lay audience. It could also still be policymakers, but now, unlike the brief, you're really writing for policymakers as well as just like the general citizen. So the op-ed, you've really broadened the base of who is likely to get this written product. And finally, what you can't do in a brief is like end with something kind of punchy or less formal, right? And an op-ed, you can kind of stick the landing in a way you really should not do in a brief. And that is a very distinct, and it can also depend like on the outlet that you're submitting to. So know that you definitely need to know your audience, but those are some key distinctions. Here are some concluding thoughts. We'll hear more about that. I am like out of time. I've hit my 15, and so I'm gonna just leave you with my email and stop sharing and give it to Debs.
Okay, thank you so much, Carrie. Debs.
Thank you, Carrie and Sarah. So I'm going to straight away go and share my screen. Thanks, Carrie, for giving us that background. It makes easy for me to say my part. So shifting gears a bit, I'm going to be speaking about how to communicate research with more of the community members. And you got to see some few examples from policymakers from Carrie's talk. So I'm a professor of geography at the Department of Geography, Sustainability, Community, and Urban Studies at UConn, and I'm also a PI at INCHIP. Very briefly, I'm a health geographer. All it means is I study where we live, play, work, or in the place where we live in the neighborhoods. How does that impact our health and well-being? So these are some of the points that are kind of the different venues and ways you can communicate research with either policymakers or community members. So publish and present, engage with media, and so on and so forth, reports, briefs, op-eds that Carrie talked about. So what I'm going to do today is give you some examples of what these kinds will look like from my two ongoing research projects, which are in collaboration with my collaborator from University of Maryland, and the team includes several other people from different universities, as well as amazing grad students. So first study is the Families, Friends, and Neighborhood Study. What we do in this study is to look at the neighborhood factors on cancer control, and also how does this neighborhood factor work with individual and interpersonal resources. So like any typical research study, we will have a flyer, and we wanted to first gauge community interest and what do they feel about what are some of their issues in their neighborhood in terms of risks and barriers and facilitators that might affect cancer control. So we wanted to gauge their perspective and understand their need and what they want to see in their neighborhood. So with that, what we went ahead and did all those focus groups and I'm trying to move away the panel here so that I could see the whole. Yeah, so we did all that qualitative work, but the idea is how we communicate that finding with our community members. We didn't want it to just take away their contribution as a provider and just not go back and talk to them. So we did a report, and this was a report that was a little longer on the four-page side, and we used several figures, graphics, to communicate our research findings tailored to the community members so that it could be quite engaging for them. We also had two versions, so one digital version, which is 4 pages, and we said we will stop at 4 pages because when you print, we wanted two-sided. So that's 1 page, two-sided, and as Carrie was mentioned, people still likes to have hard copies. So what we did is we had around 85 participants in our study. We emailed them our digital copy, but also had this touch that we mailed the hard copy to their addresses. So that's what we did with our reports. I'm not going to go into the details of the reports, but this is just an example to show how we created that report with some visuals and key findings. So our network or relationship with the community members doesn't stop with one study and doesn't stop with one phase of the study. So how did we kept going with the community members? How did we maintain our relationship and we engaged the stakeholders and community members? So over the time, as we were working on different parts, we kept connections. So for example, on the left, you see a summer greetings where we send that out, and we also kind of gave them a hint that there could be another new study. Then since we also tailored some of our engagement strategies and tools and tips tailored to our study population. So we sent out a Black History Month, and we also sent an email along with that how we celebrated in each of our labs with our study participants and our members for the Black History Month. So keeping this engagement, I talked about the FFAN studies, the Friends, Family, and Neighborhood study, but then we maintain this continuous engagement, and we move to our new study, which is related but still unique, and I'll show you how we use the same very depth of our community members, their background, their information, and we carry it to a new project. So this is a video. So we moved to new ways of engaging. So we tried with the digital copies, print copies. Now we said, let's see if the video will keep them engaging. And also it will be a new way of summarizing our work and what is the new work coming up. So I am going to play the video and hopefully it works for everyone. Can everybody hear that?
My name is Dr. Cheryl Knott, and I'm a professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. My area of work involves cancer prevention with a focus on cancer health equity for the African American community. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Debs Kosh. I'm a professor at the University of Connecticut. My area of work is in health geography. I study how where we live, work, and play affects our health and our risk for diseases like cancer. As the co-principal investigators, we would like to thank you all so much for your previous support of the Friends, Families, and Neighborhood Study, or the FAN study as we call it. Your insights that you shared in your interviews were very valuable to us.
Since your interview, you may have received messages from our team about updates on the FAN study, as well as information about a new study that we've been working on.
Yes, thank you, everyone. We'd like to share a little bit more information with you all about what that upcoming study will look like and why your involvement will be very important to us. So, as you may remember, in the interviews that you all completed with us last year for the FAN study, you talked to us about health in your community and you shared your personal experiences around factors like safety, access to resources, education, and social support from the people in your lives.
Our new study is what we call a sister study to the FAN study. In this new project, we will be taking a closer look at how racism shapes health behaviors and health outcomes, especially cancer, within African American communities. You may be wondering, well, how will I be involved in this? A major element of the new project will be the rollout of a survey with over 5,000 African Americans from our 4 focal states, including Maryland, Connecticut, Alabama, and Missouri. In the survey, we hope to learn more about how the long-term exposure to structural racism, which is the impact of discriminatory historical policies and decisions made by organizations that can affect people's health, including cancer, by shaping the neighborhoods where people live. Along the way, we will center your voice through focus groups and other community activities where hearing your lived experiences will be our main priority.
You may also be wondering how this will actually help you and your community. From the findings of this study, we plan to create what we call an index, which will measure and map the impact of structural racism and discrimination on your community. We will provide the index via an online platform that your local policymakers, researchers, and you can use to make decisions about how to help your community thrive. As a next step, we are looking forward to receiving your thoughts to get started with this new project. Very soon, you will get a link to a short survey via email.
So I'm going to stop here with the interest of time. So this was an example how we use different media to communicate our research. Oops. Yeah. So one thing I would like to point out is that communicating research can also be a two-way process. So we also shared our research, but we also got ideas from the community members for our next project, and which I think is also a cornerstone of community engaged research, community engaged policy briefs and op-eds, where we have a two-way process. So for example, we followed, after the video, we followed with a survey where we wanted input from our community members for the study title. So we gave them 5 options, as you can see here, and based upon the response, we chose Rise Above Project as our title of our new study, Rise Above Structural Racism for Black Health Equity, which I thought was a great kind of an experience, because as you can see, there are some other options which were more tending towards like the past or the negative, but this one had both the past and the causal factors as well as forward looking. So what's next? Another thing that we did was, while we're going to prepare different policy briefs, op-eds, websites, we wanted to get an idea of the color that might be used in the different venues, different outcomes, different things that we would like to share. And we chose 4 options, which were all based on the evidence and the literature and the culture. And we gave these options here, and they voted, and we tried our best to follow those color schemes for our project. So here so from their input, we chose the Rise Above Project as our name, and then This is the structural racism and discrimination index that I briefly spoke about in the video. It's not public yet. That's why I didn't show the link here. So we have a few more touches to go. But the idea here is to show that how we took into account the color, what they wanted to see on their website. So with that, I'm going to complete my part of the talk here, sharing some tips for communicating research. Be clear and concise. That goes with both Carrie's and my example of the length of the policy briefs. So make sure you have that in mind. Tailor your message to your audience. Use visuals. Share real-world applications or success stories, and leverage multiple platforms. Thank you. And here is my contact information. Over to Caitlin.
Thank you, Debs. Thank you so much for that. And we're already starting to see some commonalities between Carrie and Deb's content in terms of the two-way process. So researchers to policymakers, policymakers to researchers, and the same thing with the community and researchers. So, all right, Caitlin, really looking forward to this as well.
Great. I think my slides are up now. This has been kind of the perfect setup for what I'm going to talk about today. Thank you so much, Carrie and Debs. And you'll see a lot of synergy, I think, in the messages. And I'm going to walk you through right now a few more of the nuts and bolts in organizing policy briefs, kind of the layout and anatomy of the different sections of a policy brief, and giving some examples from the work that I do, myself as a researcher and also part of the center where I work, the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Health, where we've been participating in, the sort of policy engagement for quite some time. Let's see, trying to move my slides forward. It's just going to take me a sec. There we go. Okay. So the big picture. I want to stay focused on that and zoom us back out, back to some of the messages that we were getting from Carrie. And really, when you're putting together any type of communication of this style, you're really thinking first and foremost about kind of putting yourself in your audience's shoes to the extent that you can and are familiar with their way of thinking and their experiences. So when you're writing a brief, you're really writing it understanding some things about the life and experience of a policymaker. So when I have talked to policymakers and their staffers, the phrase drinking from a fire hose has come up a number of times. The volume of information and different types of communication that they are receiving and managing is remarkable. And they're kind of telling us in multiple different ways, like, keep it brief, keep it simple, make it worth my time to read, and let me know what the ask is. And so that's sort of the big picture, and I'll give you examples of how this works kind of in a real life brief. But really, the idea is, as Carrie said, you want to provide the cliff notes for, even though, we recognize as researchers, like, we're putting in tremendous, thought and rigor and details. Our methodology is really important. We want to communicate all that, but it's got to be reined in, and it's got to be kind of accessible and reduced to really the essence that's necessary to get to kind of the main point, which is kind of like what to do. So kind of the things you're going to be doing are making sure that the importance of the issue and its urgency are communicated, and then kind of what why this has landed in the policymaker's inbox, or why you're having this meeting in the first place. And you want to kind of minimize the work that they have to do to decode or translate your findings, because a lot of times that can be hard. We end up with a paper that has this kind of like a general statement about how, oh, these results can be used by policymakers to, inform, address this issue. But
unless you've had a little bit of practice or actually sat down to think about it, sometimes to draw the line to actual policy action is it's more challenging than you'd think. And I think that that's the work that we need to do as researchers, just a little bit more, to take it up a notch a little bit more. We can't expect other people to be doing that work for us. So just one other note. So what I'm going to present today is based on my experience kind of writing briefs and working with my colleagues at the Rudd Center on their briefs and formatting them. But in doing that, I've found it really helpful to rely on some resources from the Connecticut Scholar Strategy Network that Carrie pitched earlier. They've got occasional trainings, and they're just a real tremendous resource center. So I highly recommend checking out those resources. So, okay. So in organizing your brief, one thing you're going to want to start out with is a concise introduction that really makes the case for kind of the underlying values for why this matters and why it might matter to the policymaker. So essentially, you're trying to make the case for why they should care about this issue, and this is where having some familiarity with your legislators is pretty important. There's often kind of pretty popular values, widely held values out there. Things like, the health of our children is important, right? So this is one of those briefs. This is a brief that was done by my colleague Fran Fleming-Malici about a proposal for energy drink regulation, given sort of the prominence of energy drink and the increase in sales in energy drinks and the amount of caffeine and the potential dangers that those pose to younger bodies. So it starts off with this statement that the American Academy of Pediatrics concluded that caffeine and other stimulant substances have no place in the diets of children and adolescents. So you're kind of appealing to the fact that this is affecting children's health, and that there's kind of a medical and professional consensus that this is an issue worth paying attention to. So the second sort of component or piece in the policy brief is going to be presenting some context. So again, you're talking about, the ways that you can get the reader to feel invested in the problem, to understand the scope of the problem, to understand that there is a sense of urgency. So it's providing facts that are really easily digestible. So this set of facts here is about how, more than 3/4 of parents support limiting youth access to energy drinks. So again, this is an issue that's sort of popular. Like we've done the research, and we know that parents like this idea. Sales of energy drinks are growing rapidly. So wow, this is a problem, and it's a growing problem. And then kind of this idea that in Connecticut here, the local context, a child of any age can go into a store and they can purchase kind of any amount of energy drinks. The next thing you'll see on the brief here is graphics. This can take a lot of different forms, but sometimes the simplest form can be the most desirable and the most powerful. Here, there's this simple graph a bar graph showing the milligrams of I'm sorry, that's a typo. It's milligrams of caffeine in a 16-ounce can of popular drinks. I can fix that before we send these out, but you can sort of see the escalating caffeine levels, and from Coca-Cola to I think that's called Celsius Essentials, all the way up to 270 milligrams there. That's pretty powerful, showing that kind of like the old world beverages that we consumed as children really pale in comparison in their caffeine content to what people are being exposed to today. This is not like a complicated regression model. This is a really clear sort of description of the problem, and it can grab attention and help people understand the scope of the issue. And it's pretty visually interesting to kind of be able to communicate your point. Other ways of communicating your findings could be, like, you could use tables if they're kind of really clearly labeled. You can use line graphs or pie charts or infographics.
Or, if you're doing qualitative research, you might consider using quotes. Quotes can be very powerful, particularly if they're sort of pared down to the essential points. So this is the back of the brief. So this is kind of if you're doing a 1 to 2 page brief, this would go on the flip side. And this is where you're really talking about the solution and the action item. This is where you're demonstrating your expertise as a researcher, and you're going to probably use a phrase like as shown by our research. So you're going to, for example, you can share evidence from one study or sort of a series of studies. The kind of main point of what is shared in this brief is that, we've done studies that have shown that limiting marketing to youth is an important way to address consumption. So this can be a kind of food marketing question. If we can address food marketing, then we can reduce consumption. And so that sort of leads quite neatly into this kind of final section, which is where you are making that final pitch for an action item, the so what. And it's more than just like, we know marketing strategies are successful. Well, what kind of marketing strategies? Like, what kind of thing might work? What if we were going to pass legislation, what might it actually look like? And there's some suggestions here. Now, this policy brief proposes that legislation should prohibit the sale of energy drinks to those under 16 in Connecticut. Now, there's actually since this brief was written in, I think, December of 2024, and since that time, there has been kind of an evolution in the conversation around what has been proposed in the Connecticut state legislature. And the current proposal, I think, is much more focused on an idea around putting kind of like a warning sign at the point of sale within a store. And so that's a little bit different than just prohibiting sales to anyone under 16. But this brief could potentially be adapted to, the new, policy discussions that are happening. And so this is where kind of like knowing that life cycle of the bill and the policymaking process and what is currently on the agenda can be really important, so that you're putting your recommendation as something that, the policymakers are already considering and discussing. I think it can be really tempting also, I'll just say, for if you're not quite clear on the policy recommendations or implications of your findings, to say like, oh, we need more research, or we need more information and more conversation. But this is, that's not really, quite going to be the selling point for a policymaker, that we need more information or we need more money to study it. That's not really their domain. That's what you might pitch to a funder in the research domain more than a policymaker. You really want to come in with a kind of clear recommendation for the policymaker. And then one thing that I like about this brief is there's a bunch of references here. You can kind of pare down the references to the maybe fewer than 10 even. But what I like about this one is that there's a QR code to learn more about the Rudd Center's research on food marketing. So, as Carrie said, if maybe they'll never open that, but at least you have, given them the full package of resources that you have about the research that's been done, in case they are interested in kind of like expanding their understanding of this work. I'll then just show example number 2. You can see actually it's formatted similarly. We have kind of now at this time a template for organizing briefs for the Rudd Center, so that we can put them together somewhat quickly. I'll just kind of draw your attention to a line graph showing an uptick in household food security among households with children. Again, an issue that's likely to be somewhat attention grabbing, or kind of like have a universal importance, or somewhat universal importance to policymakers. the policy action item or pitch here is that child tax credits can be a really important tool to promote economic stability among households facing food insecurity. And so it's kind of supporting evidence for the benefits of a child tax credit. And so we used qualitative methods here. So instead of doing a whole lot of like statistical analysis presentation, I have just some quotes from our participants. And I do have a little map here showing where other states have implemented child tax credits before. And, you know, it's not always the most persuasive argument that, oh, other states have done it, so we should do it too. But, you know, so it can't hurt. And also it can provide a little bit of evidence for feasibility, or that like you could even talk a little bit about like the different models for how it can get done, right? So it can be helpful to show like if it's been put into practice in places that are similar to the place you're pitching. So, you know, this sort of summarizes some of the things that I've been bringing up, but really, you know, when you're deciding on data and visuals, and the data and visuals are really important. The descriptive data can be really great. And it can be like kind of sometimes the most digestible information to present. Nice, you know, concise infographics are great. If you are going to present more complex sort of statistical analyses, and sometimes there is a place for that, but you want to use some tricks like not labeling it like results of a adjusted logistic regression model, right? You're going to want to label it clearly like people who got this program did better than the people who didn't, right? And so make sure your headings are clear. You know, you've made it visually appealing by avoiding overcrowding and using great colors and everything you can do to make it sort of clear and attention grabbing. And then, yeah, just getting back to this point that I think we've all made now about using simple non-academic language. You don't want them to leave there with kind of doubts about their understanding of the issue. Finding a way to get to the essence, even though it's hard and we've been trained to, you know, include a lot of detail about our methods. This is not the place for that necessarily. And then a great tip is just to have someone else's eyes on it, right? Someone who's a little bit outside of our academic you know, experiences, and they can kind of look over and honestly tell us whether or not it's too jargony, and it kind of clearly communicates the point. So someone in your household, or, you know, a friend or colleague in another field. So I will end at that. I'll stop sharing my screen and we can convene as a panel for questions.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. I especially like the tip about asking someone else with a bit of an outsider perspective on how to look things over. I find that helpful even outside of the policy brief context. So at this point, we're going to turn to Q&A, and I want to collect a few questions from the audience. So please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A feature. But in the meantime, I have a question for the panelists. I think that you talked a lot about kind of, well, it seemed to me your experience is more about already being in the process of getting this research to policymakers or to the community. So at the first level, that involves asking policy relevant questions, but I think it also involves fostering relationships. So I'm wondering, for example, how do you go about starting those relationships? And so, Carrie, maybe this applies in your context to pitching the article for Newsweek. Did you have a relationship with the editor? Was it just an email that you randomly sent, a cold pitch? So how did you go about developing these contacts that would then lead to this exchange of information in this two-way process that a few of you touched on?
So a couple of things. Number one, SSN maintains a column in the Connecticut Mirror. So for anyone who is an SSN member that wants to publish in the Connecticut Mirror, we maintain the scholar reflection column, and you should reach out. We also have a director of communications that can help pitch so that you don't have to worry about trying to make those connections. Also, Danny, who's on this call, does some of that for InChip. And so UConn also has an infrastructure for those of you that are UConn affiliated. And if you're affiliated with a different research institution, you probably have similar resources as well, right? So my first thing is like, that might not be your comparative advantage as a researcher, and you may have some resources at your disposal, and you should figure out what those are if that's not in your comfort zone. The other thing, people often ask me how to make connections with policymakers, and honestly, it's going and meeting them. They are people too. And as I said, like, especially in Connecticut, they're regular people. And you got to remember that when you're writing your brief and your op-ed. I mean, I think if there's any like thread here, like everyone we are talking to is just a regular person. And going and meeting with them, going to public hearings, testifying, you know, maybe shaking their hand, asking for time, setting up a meeting if you're their constituent, especially, right? Like, introducing yourself, you know, being relevant. If you also are a UConn person and you have expertise, we have government relations that can help you with that. Right? Learning what your resources are, especially if you're doing that in your UConn capacity, you should learn what those rules are. But I found just going and saying hi and introducing myself, or going to events like Moving Beyond, which is how I met you, Sarah, right? Like, those are all really great opportunities for networking and meeting folks and just continuing those connections.
Do any of the other panelists want to add to that, or should we turn to the next question?
I can briefly add to what Kerry mentioned. I think to maintain the two-way process, a sustained open channel of communication, that what you told me as a policymaker, I came back and did that in my research project, and you shared that. So as Kerry was saying, we are also like everyday people. Research projects can go either way, go south, go north. So sometimes we can also tell them this didn't work, or this finding was not I was expecting. So do you have any insight? So I think interpreting our results, we researchers tend to do it in one or two lenses. You know, we could also broaden up, but a fresh look of the results from the policymakers and maybe some community members as well is very helpful to see what impact that did this study make.
Okay, thank you so much, Debs. So we do have quite a few questions that came in. And the first one that I'm going to look at is about the energy drink research that you did, Caitlin. So the question is, how do you deal with pushback from corporate actors? So for example, at the national level with lobbying or advertising?
Yeah, I mean, there is almost always going to be like another side presented to legislation, right? But I mean, that's why you have your brief, is you've got your talking points, right? So I think how you deal with it is that it is to be expected, but you know, you're presenting not just like an opinion, but you're supporting it with you know, a set of evidence-based statements and kind of key takeaways. And I think just like, you know, any sort of media interaction, you've got to know what your sort of three key statements are. And I think it's also it's up to the legislators as well to be asking the tough questions. Like there's hearings where they're going to be asking questions of they can ask questions of you as an expert. They can also ask questions of kind of the lobbyists or the alternate perspective, right? So the more you can serve as a resource to policymakers, the more they can question kind of the facts presented by the other side. So the stronger that relationship is, the more the other side could be questioned.
Okay, thank you.
I would
Um,
add to I would just add to that, like, just always be transparent and truthful about outcomes, whatever that is.
Yeah.
Our work is about outcomes. It should, in my mind, often not be about activism or right. Like it is about outcomes and what moves outcomes, and research should be clear about that. And that's what you should present.
Yeah, agreed.
okay, we have a formatting question about referencing. So would it be okay to inform the references as a QR code in order to save space in the policy brief?
I think that could work. I think the general good approach might be to pick the most essential references, really like the pillar evidence or studies that you're citing. Maybe it's two, right? And those might go at the bottom. Maybe it's one, right? That goes at the bottom. Particularly if like it's publicly available. But if you've got like a long list of things, or again, like the whole sort of resource library at the Rudd Center relating to food marketing, that could be linked to in a QR code. Do other panelists have thoughts about that?
I think that's right. That's what I think it's, if you can put your references there, I think preferred in the interest of transparency. I think you just always want to appear more on the upside of transparency.
There is a question for Carrie. What are some industries or career positions where people create policy that they don't realize is policy?
Gosh, I think a ton. I think so. I recently did a training with district attorneys and prosecutors, and I think I asked them who's a policymaker, and some raised their hand and others didn't, and I was like, "You're all policymakers." Like, newsflash, right? Whenever you're deciding what to prosecute or what not to prosecute or how to do that, you're all prosecutors. I think, anyone that makes a decision about like how to spend tax dollars is a policymaker in some way, shape, or form, or decides to implement or cancel a tax funded program, or spend tax dollars through a contract, or is carrying out a contract. I mean, like I said, I really think of contracting very expansively, rightly or wrongly. That's just sort of how, and with that, I think perhaps I also require folks to think that they have a duty to act, ethically in those positions that they might not otherwise do. I think, with that kind of responsibility comes an additional level of like scrutiny and just responsibility to make sure we're carrying out things in a purposeful way in accordance with laws and regulations and rule of law. So, but I think like anytime you're like touching a tax dollar, you're like a policymaker in some way, shape, or form if you're making a decision about it.
I want to ask, we have time for one more question before we're going to need to end the session. But I wanted to ask the question, and we've talked about this a little bit, but how do you make sure that the policy briefs reach policymakers? Which communication strategies do you use? And this is a question, I think, for the whole panel.
So I can go first. So first of all, it starts with your network. And I know network is not easy for people who are starting out to do this kind of engagement work at the very get-go, but that network. So that would be the first place. And websites and continuous effort to communicate that to your people at the ground. And they will also connect to the different policymakers. And as we started this webinar, policymaker definition is really broad. So start with your network, start with the communication people of whatever organization you are, whether it's an university or a CBO or something. And that would be the starting point to find the right policymaker. It's a dynamic process and it's iterative.
Carrie and Caitlin, do you want to add anything to that?
I'm aggressive. Like I also am like, you know, maybe you're the right policymaker, maybe you're not. Maybe you're the right policymaker today, maybe you're the right policymaker tomorrow. Right? Like policy is iterative, and what today's policy, just because it doesn't make it this cycle doesn't mean it won't make it next cycle, and maybe you need to know. So I'm gonna like contact them all the time. So at the start of every legislative session, I go through the Connecticut General Assembly and like make a contact list of all the committees. And when SSN or a committee brief comes out with a brief that's relevant to that committee, we email it to that committee. I am constantly emailing Danny and say, hey, Danny, I have a new thing. Will you help me pitch it as a Yukon Today story? Or help me Twitter it, or whatever. Or writing for the Connecticut Mirror. Someone from SSN recently gave public testimony, and I emailed them and I was like, you're going to need to make that a scholar reflection. Like I'm pretty aggressive because I think there are like lots of ways to do this, and policymakers are super, super busy, and we have to constantly be in dialogue and communication with them because so many people are in constant communication and dialogue. And if we are not also constantly part of that process, the voice of research is not going to be heard. And I think it is, especially as a public institution, a land grant public institution, it is our job to make sure that the research this institution is doing is reaching our policymakers. And so that is why I am so aggressive about this, and hope that all of you will join us.
Yeah, aggressive, but I think forward. I think forward thinking is another good way to put it too. Does anybody else want to add anything? Caitlin, did you want to add to this? No? Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much to all of our panelists today. I learned a lot. I hope you have had a chance to quickly browse the chat and you've seen the positive feedback in there. And thank you to our audience for the excellent questions. I want to highlight that we've added a few links in the chat for ISA's upcoming virtual events and also for ISA Connected, which we'll send out a mailing to you every month to let you know about events like this one. So please do feel free to sign up for that if you're interested in being notified of what's coming up next. So thank you everyone so much today, and good luck with writing your first op-eds and policy briefs. All right, have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.